So AAM is a business that operates, manages and develops assets in 4 states and territories. There's 31 different asset locations that we service from the far out stations of the Northern Territory through to Western Queensland, New South Wales in Tamworth, Forbes and Bathurst, down through to the chicken operations in in Murray Bridge and Riverlands, and then now again our timber businesses in South Australia. So we are heavily reliant on the integration and the functionality of our both domestic but also international supply chains and how they work effectively. And I think it was really interesting to talk about the dirty C word in COVID, is that how our supply chains reacted in that scenario. And I guess for the very first time, I think it shocked this country and maybe even shocked the world at how dependent we are on the functionality of those supply chains. And it put a lot of value on, I guess, different products and commodities, particularly food, and how that is understood by the general populace. Because I think it's fair to say nobody in my lifetime that I integrate with would ever thought that food shortages or supply chains would ever be an issue.
Thank you. So Pacific National is Australia's largest privately owned rail freight company, and we are a core part of the supply chain for Australia. We have operations everywhere from Cairns to Perth, and we run intermodal freight, bulk freight, IMEX and coal, both domestic and export. Some of the lessons that we learned in COVID were things that we have never had to experience before. We run intermodal trains across 5 different networks to get goods to where they need to go. And we were faced with having to work with local governments and the federal government to get our crews across those state borders to keep freight running. And it's just something that we had not experienced. And there were a lot of lessons we learned out of that. Coming out of COVID, we were faced with such a different challenge, being the weather. For the first time in our experience, the transatlantic railway went out for over a month, and we found ourselves land bridging to keep goods moving into Perth, specifically for supermarkets, because this was the first time that we'd really seen shortages occurring, and it just wasn't a matter of rebuilding that line. The network providers had to really get to very remote locations and think about how they were not only going to recover, but the timeframes that was going to take and what we could do to make sure that we built back better. And we've seen that again in 2022. I stepped into the head of strategic access role. The day I stepped in was the day it started raining. So that experience...
We've got some other roles you can step into at certain times.
It's funny you say that. But, and as a rail freight operator, we own the above rail asset, and we partner with our network providers to make sure that we're advocating for, what needs to happen to ensure we have a reliant and resilient network. But there's so much complexity there. I think we still have a lot to unpack.
Coming from 2 national companies, I'll speak more centrally for what it meant for us in the produce industry. We look at COVID as being able to be very proud and privileged to be part of an industry that continued to trade uninterrupted. Sydney Markets itself employs 5,000 people on site. We unload 500 trailer loads of produce per evening, and we feed the eastern seaboard of Australia. We did not miss one day of trade. Our employment within the markets went through very, very difficult times. Whilst the rest of the country, most of the country was able to work remotely, we were not. And then we also had the complexities of our own supply chains, being our grower basins, who then had their own issues in terms of labour force. So we had this rolling effect all the way back from farm. So how do we get the product from the farm? How do we actually harvest the product? How do we get it to the market? And then we get, how do we get it in? Where's the logistics and where's the freight? And how's all that happening? So looking back at COVID, for us as an industry, we came out of COVID absolutely exhausted. We had nothing left to give at the end of that period. We then, coupled to your point in relation to weather, we are always affected by weather. We take that as part of what we do. What we didn't expect was the 3 major weather events we'd had. leading into COVID, we came off the back of a major bushfire. So we're resilient, yes, but we were tired. So we learned a lot from COVID. What we saw, interesting, we saw cash disappear from the markets. And if anyone knows the market, that's, yeah. If there's anyone from the tax office near, it is all declared. But yeah, we saw some changes. We saw cash disappear from society. We went into, it drove initiatives within our own. It made us look at how we do business differently. We're generational businesses. We don't need to change much because nothing really changes. So it changed different ways, but all positive changes, really great changes. And we're really proud to be part of an industry that continue to trade and feed this country. And continue to support our growers.
Thank you, everyone on the panel there. Some really interesting insights there, and I'm sure will drive a range of questions. But I've got a couple here, and I might start with you, Heidi, if that's okay. Given that you live and breathe and live in the supply chain, do you feel like Australia has done enough in terms of its supply chain, or should we be doing more? And if we should be doing more, where should that focus be?
I'll speak to this from rail freight perspective. I think what we've seen, particularly in COVID and these weather events, is that our networks aren't resilient enough, and that's been recognised through these events. And there is work being done. We've seen an improved focus in resilience and improved focus in reliability, but there is a lot more to be done. So I don't think I don't know that we'll ever get to the point where we'll say that we are 100% resilient unless we intensely and intentionally focus on improving that.
And Garry, as a person who has exposure to lots of different supply chains across lots of different geographies and lots of different industries, how do you sort of see where we should be headed?
Look, one of the interesting challenges, Ben, about this whole thing is that there's this big misnomer, and I guess if you look out that window and where we're all sitting at the moment and what's in this proximate area within, an hour or two's drive from this location, Australia is an inhabited country, but we're far from the developed country we think we are, particularly when you get out there 2 or 3 hours and go for a drive and see what it looks like. Because 2/3 of Australia's export products and the supply chains that are linked to that are all linked to regional and rural Australia. So we look at what are the supply chains here and how we get it to our cities, but there's so much investment required in so many different areas, and that's infrastructure and supply chains to get people to go and live there first in an effective way, and then how that integrates into the broader part of the business. But the efficiency that is created by investment in quality infrastructure is unbelievable, and what that does to creating opportunities for business and employment and all those things, irrespective of what sector you pick. You can pick any industry you like, and we can find holes as to where it is. And I guess recently I was in Kununurra sometime last week. Sorry, I haven't been home for 3 weeks, but sometime last week. And just talking to some growers up there that were growing bananas. We don't grow bananas, so I was very interested to talk to them. They have a contract where they've got to deliver their fruit to Coles in the Perth market. And all of that road infrastructure has been destroyed with the floods and the issues at Fitzroy Crossing. So the $120 or $30 per pallet load that would normally be the freight cost is now $450. And there are now Queensland banana growers that have an oversupply that are trucking at that tyranny of distance because there's no other way to get it there to again put it into those markets. Now, when you think about what we are as a country and where our population's spread, there's just so much infrastructure and all of those different supply chains that depend on that require far more application of intelligence and finance than what we've done to date in the history of this country. So there's so much opportunity out there. You should see the positive side of it. Certainly room for improvement, but we are so dependent on this infrastructure that influences everybody's supply chains.
And just on that, do you think the balance is right at the moment, and the question for you, but for also for the rest of the panel, the balance is right between what is owned by the government and what is privately invested in and supporting our supply chain, or is there a better balance?
Well, there's certainly opportunities for public-private partnership. I guess there's always going to be a focus on what is core infrastructure for government to put out there. I think we all know there's a huge disparity as to the funding received by regional Australia versus urban Australia around some of this infrastructure, and we have a problem that we only have 28 million people in this country. If you go to the United States, the infrastructure and the supply chains are phenomenal because there's 350 million plus people in a not too dissimilar land area. So it's a very different equation that's impact. Like the tyranny of distance is significant in this country. We actually only have 2 sealed roads that run east-west in Australia. 2. They're about to... Anyone know the third one? Just as a matter of interest, that they're about to try and seal?
This is a real treat. Normally the questions come this way, but we're going back. I like this.
So there's a desert road that goes through Alice Springs that connects up Western Queensland across 2 desert tracks, frequented by 4-wheel drives and very large cattle trucks, that they're finally looking at eventually sealing over a period of time the Plenty and the Tanami, so that we deal with actually having a third access road. So who would have thought until we cut, the bridge got washed away at Fitzroy Crossing, you actually might need something like this. Incredible.
And the rest of the panel, I'm interested in your views on, the balance between public and private ownership, within our supply chains.
Look, I think there's a need for more consideration into the balance between public and private ownership. I mean, from a rail perspective, you're dealing with heavily regulated below rail assets and how access is delivered. So there's work to be done in that space. That's probably the big one for me.
Yeah, because you look at the state election that we've got, where everyone has the democracy sausage tomorrow morning and cast a vote. Public infrastructure seems to be a very big point of difference between the two parties. So, Caroline, I'm interested in your view on that as well, given that. Yeah.
I was just going to touch on Garry's point when you talked about produce, when we all went, but think about the flow-on effect of that. So that pallet space coming out from Queensland to make its way to Perth market has gone from $116 to $400 a space. Who bears that cost? That cost is borne by the grower. So we talk this for us as an industry comes back and converts that discussion around supply chain issues and takes freight and logistics concerns all the way back down to food security. And at the end of the day, it's okay for us as a transport operator to say we now need to put a 38% fuel levy in place because fuel levies are out of control and it's eating into our profit margins, and if we don't do this, we won't be here to service the country. Fine, we put a 38% fuel levy in place to the customer, who's the grower. The grower has not had the same rate of increases or inflation on their product to reflect the same within their industry. So they have labour cost impact, they've got all the other input costs that they're incurring on farm. They're not commercially viable. So what happens? They collapse. And what we learnt in COVID, whilst we are sustainable as a country, yes, but if we don't support those that have made us sustainable, then what does that future look like? And we see these impacts real every day in the market. So those produce concerns, and we've just seen the collapse of a major transport company now. There was 4, and those 4 all serviced our industry. When we are having issues in the market right up until very early hours this morning, and if I put a bet in this room, I'll guarantee you I was the first one up out of this room this morning. I did a 1:30 start. If anyone can beat that, I'll challenge you. And we had no product. There was product delayed. There was product couldn't go out. Why? Because we can't get trucks coming out of these major areas. So is that an infrastructure issue, or is that a bigger issue which relates to employment and opportunities? And to your point, Garry, getting these opportunities back into the regions to get people out into these regions to work and encourage them to be there to support the industries for which rely on the infrastructure, which is why we're talking today.
I can't talk for train drivers and what the issue is, but there's a massive shortage of truck drivers and trucking companies that have been forced out of the industry on a national basis of all kinds through just the additional regulation. And whether we talk about investment in infrastructure, whether it's private or public, that there's a real accountability issue here that we have as a society as to what level of regulation and costs we impose upon this. And it's pushed so many people, and there's simply the quantity of people, steering wheel attendants, drivers, to move these machines that are carrying all this freight is massive, and it's a huge national problem.
Yeah, from a train crew perspective, we are also facing challenges in that space. Firstly, the time it takes from street to seat. We've brought a lot of our training programs in-house to start, building our pipeline to ensure that we have train crew coming through. But the other issue that we face is the harmonisation of the rules that we operate under. So if we are training a crew in New South Wales, it is very difficult to take them into other states because the rules change and they have to be trained differently. Fatigue management is a big example of that. Signals are different. You have to learn how to read different signals to be a train driver, and they are not consistent from state to state. And that fragmentation really causes this hidden delay and cost in our supply chain, because you can't just get on a train and run from A to B as simply as you think you should.
It's some very, very interesting insights there. I think, Caroline, you were definitely the first up, but I know a couple of reprobates in the room who are probably still out and not home then. But a question for you around the labour point. We're certainly starting to hear that labour pressures are starting to ease. That's what you're certainly seeing in the press and hearing about. That's what's happening on the ground? Are you starting to see labour pressure easing up, or is it still as tough as it was before?
No, so labour pressures are definitely easing in terms of our industry, which makes sense because we have immigration, we have people moving around the world again, and we have people working back at farm. That's fine, but we can pick and we can harvest all the product in the world we want, but if we cannot get it onto freight or logistics to get it where it needs to be, then what is the point? And to Garry's point here, there is a major shortage of that skill base, and it is a national problem, and it seems to be the elephant in the room in most conversations, and it's a big issue.
I think the employment thing is relative to where you're located, because there's a huge shortage of labour still where businesses rely on the backpackers floating around. And I think there was a statistic I was told that there's normally, 55,000 jobs in WA that are filled by backpackers, of which there are only 5,000 in the last calendar year.
That's an incredible statistic. One more question from me before I stop hogging the microphone. We've identified a whole range of issues. Where's the responsibility for solving these going to come from?
Every person in this room deciding to do something about it. Because if you sit there and wait for somebody else to do it, it won't happen.
That's a pretty good answer. I might open to the floor. I've got plenty more questions, but here we go.
Kieran O'Gorman, McCulloch Agencies. Just a quick question for Garry, following on from that comment. As an investor, those type of infrastructure projects, is that something that you would ever think about looking at?
We look at anything, Kieran, where we believe that we can add value to what is the existing situation. Openly, there are many, many things that we would like to do, but like everybody, we're limited by the available capital to go and do these things. So in many cases, some of these infrastructure projects are not just about one party doing it, it's about multiple parties doing it. And I guess in many cases, I guess the fresh markets are a great example of this, where you can have a bunch of companies that would often be perceived as being competitors that actually act as contemporaries to get an outcome in order to do it. There are so few industries that actually embrace this correctly. And in infrastructure projects, they're certainly things that they impact everyone. And my point is very direct. If you wait for somebody else to do it, it will not happen. Particularly if you wait for government.
So can I take microphone holder's privilege, Robert Hardy from NBN. If all three of you were Prime Minister tomorrow and you had one day and you had ever-ending source of funds, what's the thing you'd do in your one day to solve the problems you've just spoken about?
I'm going to steal a quote here from a very renowned investor in the United States, is that I would change the policy that mandated that elected people had to produce an annual budget every year within 3% of what is the deficit line. And if they didn't, they all got sacked. Because it'd be amazing how quickly our budgets and our allocations and what we focused on and what we invested in would change.
No, I don't want to go next, actually.
I'm still thinking about the question.
All right, well, if you do that, then I will look at what we need as a nation to actually build resilience into our supply chains. And that's not just from a rail perspective, that is our holistic supply chain. Because I think at the moment we often look at sections and we look at this part and we try and improve here, but we miss the connection from that entire origin to destination discussion, and we don't necessarily build in the redundancy and the structures that we need for it to be what it needs to be in 50 years' time.
And I'm going to say, given how well they both answered that I'm going to be the person that delivers what they want. Because to Garry's point, if someone doesn't do it, if we don't do it, nothing will happen. So I'm going to have them on my team and I'm going to do what they say.
Jerome Chopard, guest of AAM. Garry, Australia is an island and all our states, except for Canberra, are linked by coastline. Is it viable to look at shipping as some form of moving goods from one state to another?
Look, in some cases we do that at the moment, particularly when there's grain shortages on the east coast. We tend to work out miraculously how to put, particularly when there's trains not available. Well, if it's washed out, you can't move it. Putting freight like grain on a boat and shipping it around and unloading it in places like Brisbane and Newcastle. Like there's a lot of opportunity around how we look at that type of infrastructure, because it's an untapped resource. We'll think of freight leaving this place. There's a few challenges, if you like, in the red tape that's around how you put something on a boat, and because the moment it detaches from the wharf, it becomes a foreign body, and then how you deal with the biosecurity of bringing it back on. But that's all. That logically, there'd be many people in this room, in fact, everyone in this room, that could logically solve that answer. So it's just incumbent on how we engage with government about realistic expectations, and it's a huge opportunity, but not belittling for 1 second that the greatest strength that we have is the fact that we are a dirty great big island from a biosecurity perspective, and what that does for world markets is tremendous. So there's a balance to be struck there, but there certainly is freight efficiencies given the distance. And we've got 2 roads and 1 railway line, isn't it? East-west. So there you go. We don't even have a second railway line when the one's washed out. Have a second one? Yes. I think we'd all agree with that. So they're the type of things that you can truly go back to the last time that in this country we really did nation building projects. Like this is, if you want to develop supply chains and develop resilience, you've got to invest in some of these things. How far is the train line up to that's supposed to be the inland rail?
It's 1,700 kilometres, I think.
Out of how many?
7,000.
Are we making progress?
Could you just expand on the inland rail, please, in terms of where it's up to as far as getting to Brisbane?
Okay, so not to excuse myself, but we're from the above rail provider. So Inland Rail is a project being run by ARTC Inland Rail. My understanding of the process at the moment is the SHOT review is underway, and they are delivering a report that will cover off that terms of or frame of reference that was put up for the report. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything else.
Scott Bouvier from Kingwood Mallisons. Just wonder if any of you can share any of the tech or innovations that are going on in the sector at the moment that are being used to actually improve supply chains?
In the industries that we service, it's all around how we utilise more efficient backloading of freight and how we communicate what capacity is available to do that. To give you an example, on all of our internally owned livestock transport vehicles, we're looking at making them completely dual purpose, so they take livestock in one direction and freight in the other. So that's an engineering component, but a lot of that is around how we use the tremendous apps and various technology we've got today to deal with how all of that's coordinated in a much more seamless way. There's tremendous technology that's available and been available for some time that's being utilised around GPS technology about how you track these things and move it throughout a process. But not the least of which is the technology of the provenance stories. No matter what type of food product or what have you it is, what is the traceability and the authenticity of knowing where your food come from and where it's going to, whether it's consumed here domestically or whether it finds itself on a shelf overseas. So all of those things add value and really require all forms of great technology on how they're delivered.
So I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. My name is Megan George. I'm the CEO of Freshmark, and I'll declare, yes, Caroline is my board member, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So there's an election going on tomorrow, funnily enough, in New South Wales. Final message for Mr. Menz, Mr. Perrottet or Premier Perrottet in terms of your wish list for the future?
Don't forget about regional New South Wales.
To focus on investing in the things that are going to build our future, not just the very short-term focus that may happen.
Mm-hmm. I think it's to take of the learnings of the last 3 years, but not lean on the fact, and we hear this resilient word a lot, but we're actually not resilient, and that if they are certain of us. So for us, we want a future for our industry. So what does that mean? And for our industry is in the regions. So what are you going to do to invest in the regions to ensure that this is continued growth, or else sustainability and food security is a big question for us.
We've also talked about a lot of challenges here today. So if you had just one thing, and I know we talked about it at a federal level earlier, but what does the future look like for you if you just had that one thing granted?
My one thing still relates to a federal situation, but I'm a firm believer that we actually need to confront and invest in and encourage people to go and live in regional locations. So we actually need a regional taxation system that actually reflects what is the cost of people doing that and encourage people. You know, we've got all these fly in, fly out workers that go in and out of these locations in mining industries and what have you. It'd be totally different if we had families living in those locations, because then the systems and the resources and the infrastructure that's in those locations would be proportional to the population. So getting families to go and live across rather than just all in urban areas is a tremendous thing, because it takes the pressure off the supply chains and the urban infrastructure. So that would be my...
We as a company want to deliver what matters. And so if you think about investing in the supply chains, creating that resiliency and creating that redundancy, it would transform the way Australia works. It would mean that living regionally is very achievable and would be very successful because people would have what they need and have access to it. It would help industry deliver what they need to meet their goals, to meet their customer needs, and it would actually change the landscape of Australia.
Hi, nice to see everyone and thanks for your presentations. My name's Robbie Sefton and I'm interested in a topic that's just come up a little earlier as well as just now about workforce. And all of you work in different sectors and have different areas in the supply chain that you focus on. I'm really interested to hear what you're looking at and planning for or wishing for, your vision is, for your workforce in the future. How can they have more capacity, more skills and expertise and deliver on what you need?
So, Robbie, for us, and thank you for the question, for us as a business, it's about investing in the education and training of people ourselves. So trying to get younger people in the workforce and providing them opportunities in different locations. So by way of example, we might have some young people go and spend 1 or 2 years on our cattle stations in the Northern Territory, and then they want to go off and do some study, and they want to move back to some other part. So for us, it's about how we look to retain and create opportunities in different geographic locations around that. And unfortunately, on the separate side, that where we particularly have historic reliance on casual or transient labour that's not available, that's actually driving the technology outcome. So what we're being forced to invest in from a technology efficiency outcome and from an equipment mechanical outcome is to actually solve how we do this, because there are requirements to perform the task. If we don't have arms and legs to do it, we've got to find other ways of doing it.
From our perspective, being a company with a national footprint, with depots and locations in regional locations, we invest in the communities that we work in, and it's a great opportunity for local jobs, which is very important. We are looking at training our own staff and investing in them, but with the size of our business, there is a lot of opportunity. Pacific National is also on its inclusion and diversity journey, so really reaching out and exploring different ways to employ people and letting them add value, which is really important.
I'll talk from the central market point of view and also from farm. The challenges that we have, though, are not too dissimilar across every industry. We have a pipelining succession issue in this country. Our hours, as we talk about the central market, our hours aren't sexy. It's hard. However, it provides a very good lifestyle. It allows you to work with your family. We are one big family in the markets, and we're very proud of what we do. But that generational legacy is not going to last forever. So just on that, we do have a very big topic at the moment that's running within the central markets around succession, and how we're going to attract that next generation into the markets, because we can't rely on the generational concept that we've had or the model that we've had in the past. A lot of our labour force is unskilled. So we're looking at what can we do to transition that and convert that out. So there's an employment project that we're working on at the moment through Megan, and then hoping to look at what that looks like nationally, because it isn't just our market, it's across all markets and then back to farm, we're looking at ways that from a growing perspective that we can introduce technology to take the reliance away from the heavy reliance that we have on labour force. Unfortunately for our industry, that is at least 10 years away for us. So we're in this for at least the next 10 years.
I think that's a great place to finish. But look, it's been wonderful to hear from our panel today. They've been absolutely excellent and very, very willing with their experience and knowledge.